Hello, everyone, and welcome to our third and final episode of this year's HoFH Awareness Trilogy, Living the HoFH Reality Through the Lens of Children, Parents and Siblings. So my name is Rachel Lawler, and I'm a student researcher based in the School of Health Psychology at the University of Galway. It's incredible to have so many of you join us from across the globe tuning in, and thank you all so much for joining us to discuss this extremely important topic. So just some quick housekeeping before we start. As with the previous episodes, this webinar will be recorded and available online on YouTube afterwards. And we really do encourage questions, so please make use of the chat function and then we will be able to discuss these towards the end of the webinar. It's my pleasure to also introduce our two speakers joining us on today's panel. So Joanna is a HoFH patient ambassador from Poland, and she's very kindly and bravely going to share some of her personal story with us today, offering the perspective of someone whose childhood was directly shaped by living with HoFH. So through her story, she will help us to better understand the lived experience of the HoFH reality. Joanna, thank you so much for being here and for sharing your story with us. Our second speaker is Matt, Patient Advocacy and Public Affairs Lead from the UK. He's a true champion when it comes to person-centred, patient-centred care, advocating to ensure that people living with rare conditions have a voice and that mental health and psychological well-being is integrated into care as a core part of treatment. Matt's expertise is going to help us understand why the patient experience and the factors that influence this experience is so important when it comes to understanding HoFH. So just to quickly introduce myself a little bit more, as I said, my name is Rachel, and I have had the pleasure of working with the FH Europe Foundation for the last few months while I'm conducting health psychology research on the lived experience of familial hypercholesterolaemia. So I was drawn to FH and the HoFH community in particular, as I really couldn't understand the lack of explorative and qualitative data that there was available to give a voice to those whose childhoods, lives and worlds were impacted by this lifelong genetic condition, given how much we now know about how chronic conditions have an impact on not just our physical health, but also our mental health and the mental health of family members. I've been so lucky to have met with and spoke with patient ambassadors and other people living with HoFH from across the world, and to hear their stories to try and better understand the HoFH reality, including experiences of diagnosis, communicating and navigating family genetic risk, and overall the psychological and emotional impact of HoFH. So throughout this trilogy series, we've looked at why early diagnosis of HoFH is so important and how novel treatments are changing outcomes for those with HoFH. Today, we want to focus on something equally important, and that is what it actually means to live with HoFH. Understanding the psychosocial elements of HoFH is crucial because at the end of the day, behind every data point and behind every statistic, there's a person, and a person with their own individual story and their own individual journey of growing up with HoFH. These stories belong to people whose childhoods, aspirations, families, relationships, and sense of self may have in some way been shaped by living with HoFH. Clinical research is vital, and when we look to diagnosis and treatments, producing statistical data to quantify the importance of things like diagnosis and treatment and screening is of course of utmost importance. But what we really want to highlight today, and with the help of Joanna and Matt, I really hope we can do that, is that it's equally important to capture the psychological and emotional realities of growing up and living with a lifelong genetic condition. This is essential to not only empower children and their families and anyone who is impacted by HoFH, but to ensure that we can better understand the needs of these peoples and to deliver care that recognises the whole person and not just the disease. So with that, I would love to pass you all over to Joanna.
Hello everyone, thanks for the invitation. For those who don't know me, I am a 35-year-old woman from Poland. daughter, partner, a sister, a project manager, a historian, who also happens to be living with HoFH. And I will tell this story from my own perspective because it has taken me years to learn what happened to my family. And even now, I feel there are still things I don't know. Many of these memories are painful, and the past left deep emotional scars. And as I've grown older, I've started asking more questions, and little by little, my family has shared more of our story. I come from a family of 5, and every one of us has FH. And my sister had HoFH, and so do I. Although we shared the same diagnosis, our lives turned out very differently. Looking back, I believe the biggest difference was what happened during the first 4 years of our lives. And there was a 15 years age gap between my sister and me, but in many ways the gap was much bigger than that. As a historian, I will share some old story, because the beginning of my story is actually in 1975, when my sister Anya was just over 3 years old, and some yellow patches appeared on her skin, and my mother thought they were a skin problem, but the doctors quickly referred her to specialists because they suspected a metabolic disorder. And I now believe that doctors already understood what my sister's condition was, but at that time they simply didn't have effective treatments. And also my family had no idea that this disease even existed. So it took several months to reach the diagnosis, and doctors identified it were cholesterol deposits and started treatment with the medications that were available at that time to lower her cholesterol. Unfortunately, those medications were not available in Poland at that time, and my parents had to fight to obtain them from abroad, which was difficult, time-consuming, and interrupted her treatment. As Anya grew older, her condition became worse. She developed symptoms of atherosclerosis, and doctors in Poland, especially in Warsaw, where my parents regularly took her for examinations, after a few years they already knew about apheresis, and they were working hard to make this treatment available in Poland. And around 1988, there was finally hope that she could receive apheresis. And she was already 13 years old, and that treatment was urgently needed because she was feeling weaker and weaker. And her first procedure was scheduled for after the summer holidays, but tragically during the summer she had a heart failure and passed away before even the treatment could begin. And 2 years later I was born. And everything changed because of one brilliant doctor who knew our family's history. And right after I was born, she decided to test my cholesterol level, and the result immediately showed that I had inherited the same condition. So during my first months of life, I underwent further testing, which confirmed the diagnosis, and I was about 6 months old when I started taking my first cholesterol lowering medications. And after this tragic loss, my parents devoted all their time and energy to learning everything about FH, and they followed a very strict diet for me. and later they made sure I stayed physically active. And as a child, I grew up under the shadow of the trauma my family had experienced. So my parents were extremely protective because they were terrified of losing another child. For many years, I believed I was the only one in my family with the severe form of FH. I knew my sister had died from it, and I felt that the same future was waiting for me. I didn't understand why my parents and my brother needed fewer medications and didn't have to follow such a strict diet, but they simply had a different form of this disease. I was feeling different, but mostly it was around food because I felt different during family celebrations or school events while everyone enjoyed the food, and I would hear, don't eat that, it's not for you, here's your meal, your plain boiled meat and vegetables without flavor. And food restrictions and taking medications were the hardest part for me. And later I spent more and more time in hospitals, and I was trying to understand what was happening to me, but there I met other children living with different diseases, and that helped me realize I wasn't alone. And in fact, I often felt that my illness wasn't the worst one because I saw children facing even greater challenges. And my family and I, we were so focused on survival that no one really stopped to think about the emotional side of it. There wasn't much room to process our feelings or handle them gently. Because no one questioned the medications or the doctor's decisions. We were just all united in doing whatever it took. And when I compare my story with my sister's, maybe my body is different, but I truly believe that the biggest reason for our different outcomes was that my condition was recognized from birth, and I have never developed cholesterol deposits. I have never shown signs of atherosclerosis, and a few years ago I happily celebrated my 30th birthday, even though whole family was scared when I was 13. Because they were so afraid that I will share the same story as Anna did. And somehow something my family once feared never happened. And today I feel very well. I have the privilege to watch medicine advance, and I feel benefits from every new therapy that becomes available. So my story shows how much early diagnosis and access to treatment can change the future of someone born with HoFH.
Thank you so much for sharing that with everyone, Joanna. I think, as I can see in the chat here, it really is such a powerful and moving story. And I think everyone here can appreciate maybe just how difficult it is to share something so personal to you as well. So I think we all really do applaud you for that. And you've given everyone just such an insight there as to how a condition like HoFH not only impacts you, your childhood, how you've grown up, but also your wider family system and the impact it had on them as well. So I really do commend you again, and thank you so much for sharing that with everyone. I would now like to invite Matt to present to everyone. And Matt's going to help to basically build on what maybe we've heard a little bit from Joanna so far by helping us to understand those kind of broader psychological and mental health perspectives that kind of help to shape the experience of those living with a chronic condition such as HoFH. So I'll hand over to you now, Matt. Thank you.
So first of all, thank you very much for the kind invitation to attend. Just make that in the presentation mode. I think just before we start, I wanted just to touch on really mental health and rare diseases. I think I sum up that we live in one of two places, drawing on what Joanna has highlighted. We as a community are constantly focusing on dealing with those clinical emergencies in the everyday, finding someone who knows, finding a diagnosis, trying to get treatment, the story which Joanna so bravely shared. And when we're not in that space of dealing with those medical complexities, we're alone, and it's when we're alone that the impact of that journey hits home. Today, I'm going to talk about mental health and rare diseases and try to explain it in a way that can break down that sense of isolation or enable people to understand the impact this is having on lives, to be able to connect into communities like FH Europe to get support or and to support each other. So hopefully the presentation will cover that. So I'm Matt Bolz-Johnson. I'm Patient Advocacy and Public Affairs Lead working in Chiesi. I've been invited to speak by FH Europe today. It's a non-promotional role, so I can't talk about anything relating to products, but the presentation I'm giving is based on the work I've been doing and the evidence I've been championing around mental health and rare diseases for the last 5-6 years. I always go back to mental health as a term because it can be a term which we see as something which we don't identify with ourselves. It can be something is bestowed with a level of stigma. But this is a definition of mental health which I just want to put out there, which is a WHO definition. And I love this definition. And I'll read it because it's important to digest it. Mental health is defined as a state of mental well-being that enables us to cope with life stresses, to realize our abilities, to learn well, work well, and to contribute to the community. It's an integral part of our health and well-being that underpins our individual and collective abilities to make decisions, build relationships, and shape the world we're in. And this is the critical aspect of personal, community, and social economic development. We saw in COVID the impact the restrictions on society which impacted on mental health and well-being. So I love this definition because for me, mental health and well-being is a full spectrum. It's a colour in our life, really. But when we get with mental health, because we're so connected in our community, in society, in the world. Our mental health and well-being is affected by the situations we're in. Just before this presentation, I was getting stressed because of technology. So I would put technology as possibly one of the risk factors around my mental health and well-being. But there's a set of risk factors which are external to us, which impacts on our daily lives and changes how we feel day to day, moment to moment. Poor physical health can impact on our mental health and well-being. Social isolation, financial distress and ability to work. Traumatic events or adverse life events. Living with uncertainty can cause stress and anxiety. Uncoordinated care or support can magnify stresses on our lives. And stigma, prejudice and bullying, all are risk factors. And you probably, when you read that, you probably can identify with the rare disease journey which you've traveled so far, and probably identify some of those things which have impacted on your day-to-day well-being. But the good news is there's also protection factors to tackle those pesky risk factors. So we have good physical health. So when your physical health is good, that has a direct positive impact on your mental health and well-being. Having good self-esteem, how you feel about yourself, and acceptance has an impact, a positive impact. and I love this one, being connected into a community. A lot of people with living with a rare condition, when they connect into a community like FH Europe and go to your wonderful events and see people face to face, and as Joanna highlighted, meeting other people with shared experiences, that's a game changer. That really empowers you to your mental health and well-being to be good. Being able to pursue your interests, access information and support, and have a good support system around you and being included in communications. So whilst the rare disease journey has some specific risk factors, this stuff which we can do, which being in this community can do as well, can tackle those and compensate for them. So this is more for a rare disease journey, some of those risk factors. We heard from Joanna about a delaying diagnoses for her sister, having misdiagnoses along that way, poor communication at diagnosis. So even if the diagnosis is quite quick, how it's communicated can impact on your relationship with the clinicians you're being treated by, but also it can, if it's done well, it can empower families to rise to the challenge the rare condition brings. And when it's done badly, and unfortunately sometimes it does, it can cast a long shadow over the whole of the future care pathway whenever you meet other clinicians. So communication is really key. Fragmented care, as I highlighted earlier, can increase the pressures on families. That ongoing treatment can be quite invasive at times and intensive, and families, in the lack of having a care coordinator, can become the de facto care coordinator, which puts more pressure and responsibility on the families to juggle those appointments in a week, and adds micro uncertainties, smaller uncertainties. Will everyone turn up for the appointment this week? Will the test results come back positive? So that can all lead to exhaustion as well overall. We heard from Joanna about surviving. In many ways we can be having a diagnosis of a rare condition. We switch into survival mode, but what's important is we find a new norm that doesn't become the survival mode, doesn't become the new norm of life thereafter. So it's important to do things to tackle that and to get a balanced life as well. So that living with these multiple uncertainties and not really knowing the short term or long term, the future, can really impact. And I often say diagnoses, when a clinician gives a diagnosis, what they shouldn't do is transfer the uncertainty of the diagnoses at that point. The clinician should remain responsible and for the uncertainty, and guide people in saying what they can do in the short term, what will happen in the next 6 months, and that can really help. So we also know that low awareness of rare conditions, people probably say HoFH, homozygous what? When you hear people not understanding or you're having to explain, that can lead to frustration, especially if you're having to do that with the health system when they should know. It causes frustration. It can create greater isolation. And this can all lead to stress and strain on families overall, and increase that sense of isolation, which we have to tackle and balance. So we have some statistics from EURORDIS. I won't go through these in huge detail, but we know that 70% of people have reported poor mental health, 54 feel isolated, 7 out of 10 people feel that their financial independence has been stopped or impacted, and 75% of people feel that they're diagnosed, when you get clinical care, there isn't any support for the psychological support. Family functioning is a key determinant of quality of life and mental health. When the family functions really well, life is good. And I often say mental health can be boiled down to one thing, and it's about the quality of the relationships we have with the people in our lives. So looking after each other and supporting each other is absolutely key. So a lot of time parents and caregivers don't they're the main emotional support and support system for individuals with a rare condition. But when their mental health and well-being, when they're exhausted, tired, fatigued, when it's lower, then the support which you can give is less. So the key message from today is, if you're a parent or caregiver, always prioritize something of your time as well about looking after you, because undoubtedly that comes back tenfold into the family. Siblings are often seen as can be a bit invisible in that, because of the whole pressure of doing all the hospital appointments and prioritizing all those things. So siblings can feel a bit overlooked or invisible, but actually siblings come with a wealth of knowledge. They're the ones who understand day-to-day care backwards. They understand what's going on. But a lot of the time they feel that they can't bring in, they could be having stresses and strain in their own lives, and they don't want to add to that into the family. So they keep a lot of their stuff separate. So that's something which should be thought about and given space to tackle, because they're absolutely essential part of the family and support system. And young people, when they're living with a rare condition, when they're going through adolescenthood, that's a really important and impactful stage, because a lot of time people stop taking the medication, they reject the whole thing about rare conditions, and it's about, they need to be supported to grow into a young adult and taking on the responsibilities that have. Women are the primary caregiver in a lot of cases, and we know that the roles, gender roles in trying to access support is impacted. So whilst women are more likely to be the ones to give the care ongoing, they can experience cumulative stresses around, making decisions as parents around, should I take the child to hospital? Should we, this treatment's very invasive. There's stuff which we need to support the women in our lives, because they're absolutely essential. So last slide. All rare diseases, HoFH as well, when you're living with a condition, it means you have to navigate additional challenges which can remain, which are there, and they can remain unmet because the care system isn't designed to address them. HoFH isn't just a cardiovascular condition. It affects your identity, well-being, and your ability to cope. Treatments can often be cumulative and systematic, not just clinical. And people living with HoFH have experiences of living with the condition everyday life, not just in the clinic. And it's important to square off when you go to the clinic to bring that real world experience of those other challenges you're facing into that appointment. The family are the primary caregivers and support system, and they should also look to support themselves as well. And I've covered the other two. So hopefully I covered everything which was asked of me, and hopefully some of that resonated in a good way.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Matt. And absolutely, I think I can speak for everyone here that it really did resonate. I mean, when we have someone like you who can speak so coherently and clearly about mental health, and not just mental health in isolation, but how it interplays and is such an important part of I suppose, living and having to manage a chronic illness, it's almost a no-brainer to think, why is it not integrated into typical care and care pathways for people with HoFH? I think I saw in one of your previous presentations, you said that there is no health without mental health. And I think that's really important to remember, that, your mental health and your physical health, they are one in itself. So thank you so much for that as well. That brings me on to, I suppose, just a little bit of a discussion we're going to have between Matt and Joanna as well. So throughout this trilogy, we've repeatedly kind of come back to the importance of early childhood and early childhood diagnosis, because we know that an early diagnosis as through Joanna's story we've heard, and treatment can really change the outcomes for people physically. But not only just physically, it also helps to shape, I suppose, their experience growing up as well. And we've heard today about experiences that can often remain invisible. So I'd like to maybe spend some time exploring what support for patients and families with HoFH really means. So Joanna, you mentioned obviously growing up that bit of, I suppose, trauma associated with having to kind of confront the reality of what had maybe happened within your family, and then also coming to terms with having HoFH yourself. So looking back, I suppose, was there any kind of moments in your childhood that maybe stand out as having a lasting impact on how you experienced HoFH and your diagnosis, either positively or negatively?
We were hoping that medicine will develop and that somehow there will be better medications for me. And yeah, it actually happened, because when I was 4 years old, doctors only saw liver transplant for me, but it was too risky, and actually they couldn't take livers from my parents because they had FH, so the progress wouldn't be so big, because it will be still liver with this condition. So they were waiting and waiting, and I was hoping that I will survive this waiting time, and it happened. And I was taking better medications, and my cholesterol was getting lower, and it was waiting from one test to another and checking if the cholesterol is lower. And I had more strict diet, more movement and trainings to burn this cholesterol somehow if we didn't have medications. So we tried it simpler ways, like diet and moving. So now it's very good. So I guess those developments in medicine, there were lights for us, and we were trying to keep to this hope.
Absolutely. And I think you really do kind of have that hope within you. I think that's very clear to see, is that your story is also absolutely a story of hope. But as well, I suppose, if we can think of the perspective of a child, and when you look at childhood, that is something that is obviously so difficult for a child to have to go through, and for a family to have to go through. And I suppose, when we talk about childhood in a more general sense, we want to think of it as things like birthday parties and things they enjoy, and not maybe regular hospital visits or doctor's visits or things like that. So I suppose, and maybe thinking of families who maybe have children with chronic illnesses or different chronic diseases, can you speak to anything that maybe helped you, I suppose, keep a sense of normality to your childhood as well? Is there anything that kind of stands out as, helping to keep that sense of carefree, childlike, I suppose, element to your life as well?
Well, no, it didn't happen in my childhood. We were very disciplined, and there were times I had to be very strict. I was taking medicine, for example, at 8 a.m. Then I had 2 hours. Then when I could take a meal 2 hours after medications, and 2 hours after food I could take another medication. So we were just, our life was on schedule. But on the other hand, we were trying to stay positive, and we were living normal lives. we were going for holidays, and I have a brother, and my parents were trying to focus on him as well. And well, I was feeling different because my mom was older than others children mom. She wasn't working because she stayed home for taking care of me. And but I was living in a city, in a quarter, when I had a lot of colleagues, and I was explaining to them why I can't eat this ice cream and why my mom comes to school with medications for me, and they were supportive. They accepted that, and everyone knew it's this weird girl with medications, but they were accepting me. And it's weird disease because no one could you wouldn't tell that someone is someone is having this disease. We know, for in my appearance there is no sign of a disease, so maybe it was easier for them to accept it.
Absolutely. I suppose, yeah, it's trying to kind of come to terms with that being your family's, I suppose, sense of normalcy. And as you mentioned, from the outside, it may be completely invisible, but it's something that, you know, on the inside and within the walls of your own house, it's something that your own family was having to kind of, I suppose, come to terms with and navigate in their own way. And maybe, Matt, you can speak to that a little bit more as well, because you mentioned obviously the importance that kind of those formative years from being a young child and then adolescence, and I suppose everything that comes with identity formation. Do you think there's anything that whether healthcare systems or anyone, I suppose, can do, like, to help children living with rare conditions like HoFH to, I suppose, still get to be children and remain kind of able to maintain a sense of normalcy in their lives?
I think there's a lot which needs to be done. You know, that children need to be connected into a community, you know, like go to school, and that social aspect is absolutely key to build relationships. And there's barriers and challenges for that with an invisible and visible condition. If you're going to hospital all the time and having to have tests all the time, that takes you out of school. So it's making sure the school system is informed, and a lot of times teachers struggle with understanding that. So there's work needs to be done in that area really to ensure inclusion is maintained. A lot of time things can prevent you from taking part. We heard from Joanna about, you know, eating is such an important thing in terms of community. I think the definition of happiness is sitting down and having a simple meal with friends and family. And when you feel that that's been taken away a bit, whether it's explicit or implicit, I think it's really important. So, you know, having situations where people are included in that process is absolutely fundamental, I believe, and trying to understand how we can get around the diet to enable people to contribute and take part in things. But there's other things which having that sense of purpose and having an outlet as a child growing up, you know, you have a lot of emotions. It's a long time ago since I was a child, but you know, that's quite a process for anyone going through adolescence, and finding an outlet for which young people can express themselves and form an identity and express themselves is absolutely fundamental and shouldn't be forgotten. I know a gentleman with a very different condition of father, and he listens to jazz with his son because his son unfortunately has a muscular condition, and they share in the same passion of jazz and connecting that way. So I think bringing the richness of life and enjoying life even in the small moments and finding what's right for you and where and in your family is absolutely fundamental. So maybe all that's less clinical, but the clinical bits which I think should be tackled is young people should be included in the discussions around treatment, should be brought in to feel that they have a voice in their own care, and I think that helps in terms of growing up and becoming a young adult, in which not rebelling against stopping taking medication if that's what you need to do. And liver transplantation is a prime example. I know there's a lot of young people who stop their therapies even though they've had a transplant through that time. So it's a really sensitive time, and I think we can do more on understanding that for HoFH and thinking, what do young people need at that point in time to enable them to take on a new identity, being an adult living with a rare condition which isn't stigmatized but is a positive.
Absolutely. And I think, as you mentioned there, like stigma and things like that definitely do come into rare diseases as well, particularly when, as we have spoke before, that a lot of rare conditions, not just HoFH, when they aren't, I suppose, visible to the eye, it can be kind of hard maybe sometimes for other people to, I suppose, comprehend it and to get a better understanding of it. So I think with that as well, like, yeah, the importance of just advocacy in that sense is crucial.
And just to add that developing that self-advocacy and how you communicate and when to do is something where a young child speaks about, with learns that from the parents. I know from the evidence fathers struggle with having to explain and feeling there's no social, there's no reward, there's no benefit after you have spending time, there's no social gain spending time explaining to people what HoFH would be, what is, and the importance and how critical it is. So a lot of fathers don't bother. Why bother when there's no return on that? So that explaining away is really key to try and unlock, and how to do that to make people feel connected.
And Matt, do you have any ideas, I suppose, on how you could, like that, as you mentioned, kind of different cultures, things like that, like culture stigma, there's definitely cultural sensitivities around it as well. Like, do you have any ideas on how, I suppose, families can seek support without creating kind of additional stigma?
I think connecting with patient groups is absolutely key in whatever community you are, because you meet people who understand, and I can't say how big a deal that is. It's a game changer. From spending a life having to explain to everyone and try to legitimize what you're going through is just quite insulting, really, having to say that to everyone. Connecting with a group of people who understand, and where you don't have to do that, I think automatically gives a sense of community and support and peer support. There is times where you need a different type of support, and at least if you're connected into a community, they can highlight when you might need to get a bit more support from a hospital, which should be integrated in care. So the stigma bit for me is not to focus too much on mental health, but focus on quality of life. Talk to your clinicians. Our quality of life really being impacted with all that's going on, and identifying what resources or what support could be given to counter some of those things. So language is important, and I think we need to elevate quality of life as being something more important in living well with a condition, living well with HoFH, and talk to clinicians about how best to do that, or have that discussion in the community.
Absolutely. And just to draw on something there, Matt, as well, you mentioned, I thought was interesting about the fathers and things like that. And I do definitely think family dynamics play a huge role in how we communicate and have conversations around HoFH. And maybe, Joanna, you'd like to speak a little bit more about your experience, I suppose, with both your parents and your brother, your family, all experiencing HeFH and HoFH. How was that kind of, I suppose, conversation and the family dynamic in communicating that genetic risk within your family?
My parents divided tasks between them, and my mom was taking control in giving me pills and cooking proper meals for me, and my dad was in contact with foundations and looking for solutions, looking for people that might help, and they were in different divisions. And well, they both had FH, and I don't think they were it was their biggest problem. I guess they were aware that in their families, like generations before, there were early deaths, but no one actually knew why. And for example, no one ever checked cholesterol level of my grandparents. So they accepted it. The biggest task for them was to make me live the longest as it's possible. And well, even after they lost their first daughter, I don't think they received proper help, and it was a taboo for many years in my family, and no one ever talked about psychological help 40 years ago in Poland. So it was like weakness maybe, or they thought that when you have a very serious psychiatric problem, it is when you go to hospital. But when you have a problem like this, you don't see psychologists. So yeah, they didn't care about their mental health, I guess.
Absolutely. And I think if we were to move on to maybe our Q&A section now, but to keep kind of in line with what you were speaking about there, Joanna, I see something really interesting there. Is obviously, I think when speaking for, I suppose, parents of children with HoFH, they're also patients too. And do you think if their well-being also considered, like was your parents, as you mentioned there, like psychological support definitely wasn't something that was considered, but do you think that it becomes a thing that the parents are just so concerned with the child that they then sometimes forget that they also are living through this as well?
Yes, of course. When I was few years old, they started taking care of themselves as well, and mostly because my father had signs of atherosclerosis, so he had to do something about it, and they started taking medications too. And it was easier to get them in Poland, and they were patients as well. So yeah.
Okay, perfect. And another question from our audience, for either Matt or Joanna. How do you think we can better help healthcare professionals to deliver diagnosis news in the best way possible? So I suppose helping them to, communicate that family genetic risk that can often be, I suppose, a very sensitive topic within families as well.
I can quickly say I had the pleasure of doing some training with some trainee geneticists in the Netherlands about 6 months ago, and clinicians don't get trained in how to deliver diagnoses. It's learned on the job in a lot of places. And the trainee geneticist said, what do we do? It's life-changing news. And I said, well, as a professional, do your professional job and explain and give the right information. And once you've done all that, put aside being a clinician and be a human being and be there and give support in the way that you would to another human being. Stop being a professional. As a clinician, don't transfer the uncertainty of how the future will be that the condition brings. As a professional, you take responsibility for that and say, you know, whilst Joanna, this is the diagnosis. We don't know the medium to long term, but in the short term, we can structure these things we'll do, and we'll check on these things to give some structure and stability to make it to take away that uncertainty. So those are the things I would recommend.
Absolutely. And Joanna, is there anything you would like to add to that? I suppose if you were to imagine yourself that, say, it was a diagnosis you were receiving now, obviously you were a child, your memories of that probably aren't very vivid, but if you were to receive a similar kind of diagnosis now, is there anything that you think would help in any way?
More informations and the simple information. So what is it, how it works, and the important is to highlight how dangerous it is, because I am sharing my story my whole life, and even with my family members, and it's very difficult to convince them to check their blood tests and everything, and you know, people deny the fact of such disease and push it away. So I guess it's not easy to share informations like this.
Absolutely. And another question that kind of, I suppose, links in with that slightly is about how can we support parents or patients open the conversations with healthcare professionals about not only, I suppose, when they receive that diagnosis and learning about the different kind of treatments and therapies that are available to them, but also about living well and kind of like about that quality of life that Matt was talking about, that's so vital alongside the typical kind of treatment pathways and the clinical aspects of the condition.
For me, I guess now from my perspective, it's the community acceptance and well, people are now not surprised or don't act weird about diseases of a person. So it's easier for now, I guess, for me to live with this condition. And yeah, maybe Matt, maybe you can take.
Yeah, I think you really articulated that people, when they go to families, when they see a clinician, they if a clinician just says, you know, how are you getting on, that people will open up, you know, and they'll explain some of the challenges they're facing. There's something called psychosocial care. You know, it's something which is an integral part of care if you have a child living with a pediatric oncology, pediatric cancer. So in pediatric cancer, psychosocial care is a staple, I think, wherever I've been and know. So why don't we not have that for rare conditions? So there is a care model out there, and that isn't about, yes, it's having access to a psychologist when needed. But the psychosocial care model is looking at the clinical team and enhancing that medical team to be psychologically informed. So the words I use matter. How I talk about the condition has a greater impact on the way you see the condition you're living with. So if the language I use can set your expectations, your beliefs about living with the condition and you know, it can either raise a stigmatized view if language is used badly. So words matter. So all clinicians should be trained in being able to have a level of communication, which handling difficult news around diagnoses, but in everyday care, you know, is there, you know, talking about treatment going on apheresis, or, you know, understanding and saying, well, okay, where's the family in this situation, in this in the journey, the natural history of the condition, and the treatments which are being offered? Do they need additional support, or have they got a support system there? And it's asking those questions, which is not a difficult thing to do. And going, okay, well, you're a single mum in a foreign country, your family's in an, well, the clinicians can connect you with a patient group for HoFH, local one, to get information, as Joanna said, which can really help families not being overwhelmed with information. But so there's stuff which can be easily put in place, which doesn't cost anything, which is about enhancing care to be more psychologically informed.
Absolutely. And I think that definitely makes a lot of sense. As you said, the psychosocial model, and when you look at it as a way of, it's not just a disease, there's a bigger picture to it. There's a whole life, there's a person's experience and all the things that go with that alongside that. With that, I will conclude the Q&A, but I have been informed that any kind of questions that come into the chat box, we will go through them and we'll hopefully have experts answer them for you on a post through the FHEF website. So thank you so much for your contribution there. And throughout the trilogy, I suppose, to wrap up, we have explored why early diagnosis matters, how treatment possibilities have been evolving, and today Joanna and Matt have both shared, I suppose, what it means to live with HoFH and how we can better understand the different factors that interplay and impact this experience. So I suppose if there's one message that connects all three of these discussions, it's that our progress is not just measured with the new guidelines and the new therapies, but it's measured by the lives of the advances those advances make possible. And I think we all hope to look to a future where children will be diagnosed earlier, a future where effective treatments are accessible, and a future where no patient or family feels alone. So with that, I'd really like to thank you all for joining us this year for the HoFH Awareness Day campaign and New Hope. Just to remind you from the housekeeping at the beginning, there will be a recording of the webinar, which will be available soon on YouTube. And like that, any questions that we didn't get to answer, because I feel like we could talk about this discussion for absolutely hours. So we will hopefully get to answer those for people as well. Just to quickly thank the European Atherosclerosis Society, the International Atherosclerosis Society, and our sponsors as well. So it was made possible through the support of the QC Group and Ultragenics as well. And I think the biggest thank you needs to go to, of course, Matt and Joanna for sharing not only their expertise, but also their lived experience. So thank you from me and from everyone else. It's been an absolute pleasure, and it's been a pleasure to be the moderator of this session here today. So a huge thank you to the FH Europe Foundation as well from me. Thank you so much, everyone.